In this episode, I'm going to share a very important book, I think, for any ambitious person. It's called Never Enough, Barista to Billionaire by Andrew Wilkinson. Now, let me start by sharing what made me, drawn to this book in the first place. First of all, I discovered Andrew Wilkinson on My First Million. Great podcast. He's been a guest probably over 20 times at this point. And one of the things I remember just being shocked at was how down to earth he was, right? He didn't seem what you may expect when you think of somebody, who's worth hundreds of millions of dollars or $1 billion. Like, he didn't have this arrogance to him. And there were a lot of things about how he just how he thought about things that made you kind of intrigued and respect him, right? He's one of the favorite guests for My First Million. Every time he comes on, everybody loves that, right? So when I found out that he had written a book, I was very compelled to, work my way through it. And I have to say that it reads like a novel, right? It's like something that once you start, you're not going to be able to put down. And I'm actually very shocked. I didn't expect the writing to be this good. I didn't know what to expect, to be honest. But what I know is I was trying to get inside the mind of someone who's a billionaire. And I was very curious, what that journey, what that path looked like from, nothing to something. And I think that, first of all, shout out to Andrew Wilkinson for being so honest and open, because I think the lessons that he shares in this book, for any person who is interested in business and, respects the greats, right? You wonder at some point, like, what would it be like if I was in that position, right? And the way that Andrew writes this book, like, you can truly picture yourself in his position, going through all these things that, quite frankly, you don't get out of reading books and biographies about other billionaires. And I partly think that's because so many billionaires are, older. They're from a different generation, they're just not as relatable in many ways, right? Versus somebody like Andrew Wilkinson. I mean, he's a relatively young guy, and he has a lot of relatable things that have, driven him to be who he is. So what I mean by that is, he's a billionaire and he's got this this ambition inside him that has allowed him to get to where he is, right? But when you hear him speak and how he carries himself, like, he's not giving off that vibe that he's trying to fool you or he's trying to put on some kind of front like you get from some of the biggest billionaires that might come to mind. The other thing that is very massively important is, and he shared this on a podcast episode too, but he shares like what it felt like at different points to have different amounts of money, right? So being a billionaire was not the thing that made him feel the richest, right? It was like, it was having the first million, the first 10 million, what did that feel like? He describes very vividly what that would be like, if you bought a ton of houses or you decided to go, now you've leveled up and you're hanging out with a bunch of rich people. What are they thinking about? What are they doing? How does it feel like to try to be fitting in with them? There are so many tales in this that many are cautionary tales. And I think one of the cool things is, if you find yourself with that hunger for just more and more and more, this is just a great example of somebody who did that, right? And has the communication skills to be able to describe what it felt like, and I think it leaves us to make the decision if that's, that journey is worth it for us. But I think even if you don't want to be a billionaire, I think, again, if you're ambitious, you're going to get a lot out of this book because, one of the metrics of success, right, is money. And this dude has definitely acquired a lot of it. But he has a unique view on it. I really respect how, he tells this story about, being at a conference and how somebody turned to him and, asked, what kind of business he had or whatever. And after he answered, the dude was like, oh, a lifestyle business. And then he turned around and like didn't speak to Andrew for the rest of the conference. And that vibe of like being dismissed, not being taken seriously, you get to hear that from Andrew's perspective, like not being of that same cloth, right? Of a billionaire from the start, or somebody who, just wants more money for the sake of more money. I really respect how Andrew talks about all businesses being like lifestyle businesses. What's the point if it's not improving your lifestyle? And so I find it very fascinating. Like also what keeps driving him, right? At this point, he's got it all. What is driving him? And so you get some answers to these questions. And I'm also very impressed at the length of this book. I mean, look how thick this is. It's not very thick at all. And it's beautifully written. Like you will get a lot out of this. I think in the back, James Clear wrote a blurb for this book. It says, like going to business school and therapy all in one book. And I feel like that is so true. I kind of chuckled at that when I first saw it. But when you go through it, it gives you the gift of, I think, realizing, I don't know if I really want that. So I'm just surprised at the amount of reflection that kind of happens naturally as you're engaging with this story. It's just like watching a movie, watching a show. It like really, you get to feel what it's like to be on this ride, going from a barista to a billionaire without really having to do all of that work, right? So I want to go ahead and dive into some highlights that I took. So one of the first ones was Warren Buffett has a saying, you don't know who's swimming naked until the tide goes out. Unfortunately, you don't know who the jerks are either. And this is something that, is a preface for some things that come in this book where, of course, in your route to $1 billion, you're going to encounter some weird characters, some people who, are deceiving you, some people who aren't, who they say they are. And I don't know, I think it's refreshing to kind of see that Andrew did go through that, and things that you feel would destroy people, like he still was able to come back from these things. And he shares a lot of lessons from, what it's like dealing with people. There's this other quote or highlight here. He said, like so many aspects of business, these aren't discrete skills. They are instead often qualitative skills you can't teach in a class. It's all tacit knowledge, training your instincts, learning how to deal with the quirks and foibles of other human beings. Now, in a podcast episode, I remember Andrew Wilkinson saying that if you only read one book, let it be The Laws of Human Nature by Robert Greene. And, I've read it, listened to it, and I totally agree with that, because they're like, when you realize how in everything we want and everything we're doing, at the end of the day, the common denominator is people. You're dealing with people, and they can make your life easier. They can make your life harder. And the laws of human nature really digs into these things that, would take you decades to learn on your own, and maybe a lot of pain and heartbreak and anguish en route to learning that. And so I really love the lessons that are in that book. And when he said that, and after you read this book, you can kind of put together like, oh, right, it was to hopefully avoid some of these people who waste a lot of your time, energy, money, and cause some chaos in your life. So anyways, that was one of the first things. The next highlight that I had was something that I don't know why this stuck with me, but it did. And he says, I had shelves displaying fancy liquor I didn't even like the taste of. There's something so beautiful about that line, because he's describing this moment where he has everything. He's playing the part of being this really obnoxiously rich person. And he's looking around at things that he has, and he's like, I don't even like this. Why is this even here? Right? There's also another story he tells about how he bought a bunch of houses, right? Because that's what else do you do with your money? You invest in some in real estate, right? And just his manager or accountant or whatever calling him one day, basically being like, look, like you're losing money on this? Like, you're not even staying in these places, blah, blah, blah. What's the point? And he describes this moment of like the things that, you know, he owns are owning him, where he doesn't care about these other houses. He doesn't, like, he just wanted them for the sake of having them. But the amount of money and energy and people that it takes to keep just one of these houses going, you know, it is surprising, right? Like, and then you add that up across multiple properties, and now it's like a second mini job that you've created for yourself. And so I found it interesting. Somebody who has access to buying all the property that they want goes ahead and does that, and then still basically ends up deciding this is crazy, this is too much, selling a lot of it, really only maybe owning his own home and I think one other home, and then decide like everything else I'm going to just rent, right? And so it's kind of this funny full circle moment of like, what is too much? How much property is too much? Especially if, you know, that's not your lane and you don't want to really, you know, focus on that. So that was very interesting. We liked to joke that we stuck forks into electrical sockets for a living, hopefully learning something from each jolt, eventually getting better at business. What he's describing here is what is an iteration, right? An iteration is something that is a repetition, but it has a feedback loop that allows you to spot the error and, you know, maybe fix it. And so basically, I just thought that was such a great visualization analogy for really what it's like, not just in business, but getting better at many skills. You taking yourself to the point of, you know, feeling a little bit of pain from that shock and being like, all right, don't do that again, right? Let's find another way. So great reminder that so much of learning is about pain, right? Avoiding pain, avoiding failure. There's a lot of research that shows how far we will go to avoid failure, rather than if we're presented with the option that, hey, you'll get this, this is the reward, right? Even though that sounds compelling, you know, in many cases, you know, having a failure that is looming near you is kind of the thing that motivates you, right? The pain that pushes you to try a different way, or, you know, not get shocked the next time. Okay, now this next highlight was one of my favorites because it discusses this concept of, you know, when you have more money than maybe the people around you. And I don't think that you have to be a billionaire at all. In certain, you know, circles, it may just be that you have slightly more than everybody else, right? Or drastically more from their perspective. It may not be $1 billion, but people might look at you like you're a billionaire, right? That must be nice sentiment. And so I was very curious to how he was going to talk about that in this book, or if he was going to refer to it at all. And so he says, it was a catch-22. I was either implying they couldn't afford it and rubbing their nose in it, or I was rude and miserly. It triggered a cascade of weird dynamics of envy and jealousy, which caused all sorts of unspoken rifts and issues. I began hearing soon-to-be former friends make little passive-aggressive comments. Must be nice. Honored you made time for me. What's that, like a penny to you? I could feel that they were no longer rooting for me, that I was now a competitor, rubbing their faces in it, the tallest blade of grass which needed to be cut down to size. An envious look on their face as I told them about a recent win, something I soon learned to censor, or the almost imperceptible flash of a smile under a grave face when I shared a loss. When I told another successful friend about this experience, he told me an anecdote about William Golding, the author of Lord of the Flies. At the time, he had just won the Nobel Prize in Literature, and a young writer asked Golding what it felt like to receive such a prize. His response was telling. You find out who hates you. So this part was so it really clicked with me, because we all have this image of like, when we have, you know, insane amounts of money, we're going to, you know, I want to do this for this person. I want to take this person out for dinner. I want to pay for every dinner, right? But what you don't realize in that, you know, vision you might have is how that makes other people feel. And Some people will like that. Of course, some people will expect it. And like he said, you just can't do it right? You're kind of like, am I offending them by paying for this dinner, right? Or is it expected of me? And so that tension that you experience as a very rich person was interesting to see how he dealt with this in his mind and with people, right? One of the parts that he says here is how he learned to censor recent wins. And that is something I found to be kind of relatable, where like when people around you are not maybe doing as well, they're not as happy, and by well I mean like they're just not as happy maybe with their own lives, and you share a win, maybe you're having a lot of wins, right? And you're sharing that, it does at a certain point feel like bragging, right? And so it's very interesting how this like image that maybe Andrew had of like, oh, when I'm a billionaire, people are gonna like look at me like this, like respect me or love me or like me, those kinds of things. And he really reveals the other side of it, which is like, what is it like when people hate you for just having a lot of money? This also reminded me of something that Dane Cook has said before about his fame, right? Where it's like a pendulum. Like you get maybe the biggest you can be in the world, and you think you're going to, see all the people that like you, but really what it is it opens the door to all of the people who hate you. And so very similar sentiment to what William Golding here said. Now, I enjoyed this next highlight because he talks about chasing after the things that, other people assign value to, which is so common, right? So, for example, for most academics, there is nothing more important than getting published in prestigious journals. They live or die depending on where they get published and how many times their paper is cited by others. Their refrain, publish or perish, to the rest of the world, this means absolutely nothing. It denotes absolutely zero status to 99.9% of the world. But in the world of academia, it's everything. The same is true of writers trying to hit the bestseller list, or actors and musicians trying to win awards, or even something as simple as a corporate job title or a corner office. We all seek external gratification based on what our peers tell us we should want. What's sad about this mimetic phenomenon is that it convinces people to sacrifice their own happiness to achieve whatever goal their peers have assigned value to, even when it's not an authentic desire of theirs. It seems to be everywhere, and it begins early, preying on the most insecure. Look at any high school hallway, all kids trying to look the same, talk the same. And, this goes on for a little bit, but you get the point, right? I thought this was such a, like an observation full of wisdom, right? Realizing he did this in his own journey, but how we're all doing this, and it only sometimes, if you're lucky enough to get to the end and you're like, oh yeah, this was not what I thought, you then maybe go on to have this reflective process, right? But if you never really get to this end of what you thought, like the bestseller list or, the award, it almost is like you still are holding on to that hope that it's going to do something, right? I think it was Will Smith that said, like, when you don't have a lot of money, you at least have that hope that like, oh, more cars, more this is going to solve it, right? But like when you have all the money that you could imagine and you feel bad, then you're like, it's a different kind of depressing, because you're like, wow, there's this didn't do it, right? And I thought this next highlight was kind of a cool metaphor. So a metaphor came to mind. Imagine you wanted to travel from Seattle to Hawaii by sea. My approach had been akin to handcrafting a boat using logs I'd found on the beach with a few buddies who had never built a boat in their lives. Sure, it was possible we'd make it to Hawaii, but it would be a miserable white-knuckle journey and we'd probably drown. Buffett, meanwhile, had found a cruise ship with an expert captain who had already mapped out the ship's course and was ready to set sail. All he had to do was buy a ticket, one of many stock certificates, relax on the sun deck, and enjoy the ride. So this is kind of, I think he's describing a moment in this book where he's really realizing how he needs to level up, like his systems, his way of doing things, the people he's working with, all of that, because what got him to, this big point is not what's going to get him to the next level. Anyways, this next highlight is a cool quote that kind of stuck with me. So there's a famous Upton Sinclair quote: "It is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on his not understanding it." It's kind of wild. And he goes on to mention how at this moment, this quote surely applied to me. Now, this next part I highlighted because he's describing to himself who is the ideal, CEO. Who's the ideal, person I'm looking to lead these businesses I'm acquiring, right? And so he describes what he's thinking, which is kind of his internal monologue around, okay, what's the ideal person? And so I kind of highlighted these because these are the skills that people and billionaires like Andrew are looking for, right? And so what is that? So he says they'd have a good eye for design. Taste can't be taught, but also be masters of business management. They'd care about our current employees and be cautious when it came to hiring new ones. They'd push our profits to new heights without alienating our current customers, and they'd know how to sign new clients. Oh, okay. This next highlight is one of my favorites because he talks about a principle that I have found myself constantly using even before I ever heard it from Munger. So he goes, by this time we had burrowed our way through every book on Warren Buffett and had moved on to his business partner, Charlie Munger. One of his quotes that stuck with us was the constant refrain to invert, always invert. Munger said that problems are often easiest solved in reverse, and explained that it's much easier to think about what you don't want than what you do, to think about what you hate than work backward to optimize your life to avoid the things you disliked being a part of. Now, this is so genius, first of all, but is also a method of solving problems that I find myself constantly using. So I encourage you to try it. Anytime you're stuck on something and you're looking for an answer, invert it and go, okay, well, what would be a bad answer, right? When you're looking for the right question, invert it, what would be a terrible question? Now, this next highlight, Andrew describes how they use this concept of inversion to basically make a list of what we called our anti-goals. Once Chris and I had itemized everything we hated about our jobs, we spent the next several weeks thinking about how to delegate and structure things so that we weren't responsible for any of those tasks. So the anti-goals, I think, is a great general purpose way to kind of begin applying this inversion concept is like, do that for yourself. I certainly did it for me when I went through that. And so that's one way to use it. But again, zoom out and try to apply it in every situation you can. I've just found it to be such a fun exercise that actually makes solving the problems easier. My key insight at this time was one that would become the core of how I run my businesses today. It's not enough to do what you love. You also have to stop doing what you hate. The goal isn't, as many people think, to not work at all. It's to only work on things that you enjoy doing. The stuff that you do, even if you didn't get paid for it. This was actually a huge insight for me too, as I kind of went through this, because it's like, what is the point when you have that much money to be doing stuff that you actively hate, right? And of course, you have some artificial struggle that you are building into the process because maybe you don't have that in other parts of your life. That totally makes sense. We're all doing that too, right? That's what working out is like, because we don't move as much throughout the days now, we have this artificial method to make sure that we shore up those gaps of movement, right? Anyway, I thought that was a key insight because it's just so, it flips what people normally think about when you make it, right? You're just going to not do anything, when that's not true. It's like, you're going to want to do something probably, but over time, this can be applied even if you're not a billionaire, right? How do you move on this continuum of doing more of what you like and less of what you hate? And of course, that's not always possible in certain structures, but it's certainly worth striving for. Now, this next one I thought was kind of funny. He says, there's a saying about people like this: never wrestle a pig. You'll both get dirty, but the pig will enjoy it. I don't know why there's so many of these great one-liners and sayings that honestly I had never heard of, but that have stuck with me ever since. And this is certainly one of them. After all this, I realized that wealth came at a heavy price: risks to personal safety, envy that strained relationships, resentment within my social circles, and anger from those who misunderstood my intentions, each taking its toll on my peace of mind. Now, this next highlight is very cool because basically Andrew and his business partner have set out to talk to, tons of other wealthy people about, how they think about this stuff and basically just getting advice from them, right? So he says, we weren't getting advice from these people. We were hearing the envy they had of other people's lives, completely blind to what was exceptional about their own. Can you believe Bezos just dropped $165 million on what? His 10th house? One CEO proclaimed. Unreal. He's just so fucking rich. Wait, aren't you worth like $1 billion? I replied, genuinely confused. What can Bezos buy that you can't? He thought for a moment, then his eyes went glassy. I have nice yacht money. Bezos has super yacht money. And basically it just, goes to show how everybody was just trying to get nicer versions of the same stuff, right? It's kind of like it never ended. You would think that, once you have the yacht or once you have, the Porsche, it's like it ends. But no, now it's, okay, well, there's a Lambo, right? What's the next thing? Which goes to also show how tied to status our lives really are, right? It's like, in many circles, if you stayed in the circle that you were in, right, you would probably be like, wow, I have it all. But then the second you step up, it's like, oh, now you have the smallest yacht and see yourself as somebody, who needs this bigger one. And it just kind of feels, the feeling I had, and I'm sure that Andrew had, was just like, wow, like this is not what I want. This unsatisfaction is not sustainable, right? There's another highlight here. All of them seem to be caught up in a game of who has what, and yet they had everything. Now, this next highlight, what's cool is he's sitting down with somebody who basically has wisdom and who is living life maybe a little bit closer to what Andrew wants, right? Who seems comfortable with what he's achieved and has moved on to kind of just living life, right? Versus Andrew is feeling like, I can't stop. How do you actually throw in the towel? I mean, and so basically this highlight, he goes, I took this and thought about it. I'd been where he was 100 times by now, and I couldn't do it. I wanted to know how he had pulled off the impossible. Isn't that a huge hit to your ego? How do you feel when you're hanging out with other wealthy people? I asked him. And he says, I feel like I went to rehab and got clean, and I'm hanging out with a bunch of addicts. Their lives revolve around drugs, but for me, having space from it now, it seems insane. And he says, I felt my cheeks flush. And basically it goes to show you, like, there was no easy way out. I think actually it was Derek Sivers who he's sitting down with. But Derek Sivers joked around about how he has some really expensive suits, right? And that's kind of like makes him feel rich, makes him feel whatever. But like the feeling of being pulled or drawn towards doing something bigger, competing with these people just to have more, from what I remember, that didn't just go away, right? Which is why I think he describes it like this. Oh, I feel like an addict, or I'm around a bunch of addicts, and it just seems insane, right? So I just thought, and I think Andrew said this in the book too, just having a lot of respect for people who are able to walk away and be like, yeah, I'm good. But it really is kind of like a cool talk that he seemed to have with somebody that was like, yeah, he had nowhere near the amount of money that Andrew did. I think it was in the tens of millions of dollars, but still it's like, how did he feel like his was enough and Andrew didn't? And I think that was just an interesting interaction in this. Oh, so he talks about this next highlight. In this next highlight, he talks about basically Matt Damon, right? And he goes, he realized the fortune of winning it at a relatively young age. He imagined the hollowness of winning it at 90 after a lifetime of yearning, only to realize that it was just that, something to yearn for, nothing more. Damon concluded his story by noting how grateful he was that he now had the rest of his life ahead of him to focus on what truly mattered, honing his craft and telling stories instead of fixating on little gold trophies. This was such a powerful part of the book because he describes like something to yearn for and nothing more than that. And it just goes to show you like it's how is it different than wanting a new pair of shoes, wanting a new, whatever new thing you want, right? It's desiring something. And it's just interesting because it comes back to what we started with earlier in the episode where Will Smith was talking about how when you haven't still made a bunch of money, like you still have that to hope for. But once you get it, you're like, whoa, okay, this is not it, right? And so, I don't know, is it nice to be able to have this thing to desire that you're not going to get, and that kind of keeps you on the chase? Maybe, but also it feels like it could also be a very not fulfilling way to do it as well, right? And I think this last highlight I'm going to share with you sums it up pretty well. So he goes, the emptiness of making money taught me something I had been so slowly learning, that the payoff wasn't the point, it was the process, the act of building something, of designing the life you wanted, scratching itches and solving problems, the struggle of creativity, helping people reach their potential, the flow state, the journey itself. It's all so obvious in retrospect. If $1 million didn't give me joy, why would 1,000 more millions? We all know this. We've heard it a million times. And yet everybody, myself included, seems to need to learn the lesson the hard way. As G.K. Chesterton put it, to be clever enough to get all that money, one must be stupid enough to want it. What a beautiful quote. And so I'm going to end it on that. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Drop a comment if you did. Make sure to grab the full book, link in the description below. Very well worth a read and worth gifting to people who are very ambitious in your life. They might enjoy this. But thank you again for hanging out, and I will see you on the next one.